Fraser Island is now Gari. It's gone back to its original Bachelor name, but this isn't the first time Indigenous language has been used for a place name. Far from it, in fact. Rose Barrowcliffe is a Bachelor woman and the First Nations advisor to the Queensland State Archives. Good morning, Rose.
Hey, Sarah.
Now, we've heard a lot about the official renaming of Gari lately. How unusual is it for something like this to be named in the correct Indigenous language?
You know what? It's actually been part of our conversation in this state almost for as long as we have been a state. So we have some records at Queensland State Archives that show that this conversation goes back as far as the 1860s about naming place names or retaining Indigenous place names wherever possible.
Really? So how much of a priority has it been to use Indigenous names for places?
Well, what I've seen consistently is that the colonial government always had it as one of their principles that we should be retaining Indigenous place names where possible. Obviously, there was one of the other principles is that, you know, where possible, we should name them after English gentry or something like that to respect the empire. But there was definitely this recognition that the Indigenous place names were very specific to that place and told us something special about that place. And we're also part of the uniqueness of not only that place, but this whole continent. You know, we have this ancient culture and we should try to keep it alive as much as we can.
So what sort of places have we seen named the Indigenous names?
Well, all around the Sunshine Coast, we're surrounded by it. So I think that's really fantastic. Perhaps we don't recognise that as much, but, you know, we have Maroochydore and Mooloolaba and Beerwah and Woombye. These are all Aboriginal names. So we do have a lot of Aboriginal place names. It's become part of our everyday speech. So I guess people don't recognise that they're actually speaking an Aboriginal language when they're using these names.
It's interesting because, you know, when I think of history, I think of a lot of our Indigenous history being lost and it really not being a priority for the government at the time back in history. Do we know why it has always been, you know, a priority or important to keep those Indigenous names when making decisions?
Well, there's a few points that come up in some of the QSA records, and one of them is that if you're using some of the colonial names that we still have around, so say for example Sandy Creek is a really common one, or places or creeks named 1 mile, 2 mile, 5 mile, those were actually markings on a map by the surveyors, and they're really just supposed to be an indication of what the conditions were to travel through that country. They were never intended to be place names as such. And what we see in some of the QSA documentation is that there's quite a I guess scathing opinion of these being adopted as place names, because they're like, it's just really bland actually to name places after these in such a generic way, and also they note that there's some names like Sandy Creek that occur over and over again, so over 100 instances of Sandy Creek. And then it becomes difficult to distinguish, well, which Sandy Creek are you talking about? Whereas the Indigenous place names are specific to that area. So it's easier to identify where specifically they are.
And I guess the Indigenous place names give us a bit more information about the place as well, you know, like Woombye, which traditionally means the black myrtle tree, which of course there were a lot of back in Woombye in the day.
Yeah, exactly. And also, you know, you think about those names would have indicated to people passing through those regions, or even for Kabi Kabi or Jinnabara when they were teaching their kids, you know what sort of food or resources to find in that area simply by the place names. So that was really important as well.
Yeah, that's true too. What else do these records, the QSA, kind of tell us about history?
One of the challenges that we have in some places, though, is that so what happened in the 1950s, 1960s through to the 1970s is we had a Queensland Place Names Board, and they would give approval essentially as to whether names could be used. And they had a policy as well of encouraging the adoption or the retention of Indigenous place names. But also they needed some way to verify that those names were appropriate. So that part of their policy is that they should be using language names specific to the language group of that area. But the resources they had to verify that were often word lists that came from non-Indigenous anthropologists or early colonists who'd travelled through the area, and they'd written down the words that they'd heard and sometimes the translation, but often they didn't put the name of the language group that that word came from. So unfortunately, they were just recorded as Aboriginal language names. And you see this as well a lot in letters that went to the Protector of Aborigines office, for example, requests for names that could be used to name railway stations, and they'd send the letter on to Cherbourg, that was actually, was a mission at the time, and ask them, oh, what's a word we could use, or what's the name for creek, or what's this sort of thing, and it would just go back up the chain to say this is an Aboriginal word that means this, but without saying whether that was a Waka Waka word or a Kabi Kabi word or something like that. So that has been one of the challenges, and that did result in some areas being named with a word, an Aboriginal word that wasn't necessarily from the language group of that area. But what we're seeing now with a lot of the language revitalisation work that's happening, and I know you have Des Crump, my colleague, on the show occasionally, and he is leading some of that work with QSA, doing amazing work. And linguists around Australia now are increasingly being able to reconnect these lost words back to their original language group by looking at how the word is put together and looking at patterns and realising, oh, that is how a word is constructed in this language group, for example. So increasingly we're able to connect it back to the right language group, which is great.
Yeah, that is great. I wonder if there'll ever be any kind of repatriation of it going back to the correct language group in that region.
Yeah, I hope so. And I guess the most exciting thing about that is that it's Indigenous linguists who are really leading that work as well. So that's really exciting to see. It's really an active agency in cultural revitalisation. So, a place name is not just a place name. It, as we've already said, it tells us about what exists at that place. So it's about more than just putting a place back where it should be. It's about understanding more about that place as well, which is great.
So interesting. And yeah, I think a lot of people hearing the naming or renaming of Gari have thought, oh, what's going on? But it's amazing to think that this has been happening for so many years and decades.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, the oldest record, or the oldest letter that's sitting in this bundle of records at Queensland State Archives in 1860 is from the first governor of Queensland, Sir Bowen. So, it's not as if this has any particular political underpinning to it. We see that even the first governor of Queensland was encouraging the retention of Indigenous place names as well.
So I know QSA often does things around language and has workshops. Is there something coming up that people can get more information at?
There absolutely is. In fact, we have another one of our First Nations languages workshops being run from the 10th to the 13th till the 13th of October this year, being run by the amazing Des Crump. And any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are interested in doing some language research and learning how to research their language can put in an EOI, and they would have to do that by the end of this month. But if you go to the Queensland State Archives socials, either Facebook or LinkedIn, you can find the information there.
Fantastic. We'll check it out, Rose. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah.
Rose Barrowcliffe, a Bachelor woman and the First Nations advisor at the Queensland State Archives. You're on ABC Radio Queensland.